Russia was caught completely off guard. Near the Polish border, the peaceful morning skies of Eastern Europe shattered with the deafening roar of American helicopter blades. One after another, they emerged from the mist. 50 CH-47 Chinook transport helicopters of the U.S. Army, their twin turbines slicing through the air like immense metallic creatures. The massive formation moved with perfect coordination, as though guided by an unseen command rehearsed for months in advance. Their arrival was anything but accidental. Every second, every movement had been planned and synchronized. From Kaliningrad to Moscow, radar systems began to buzz, monitors flickered to life, and control centers reported unusual patterns in the skies. Analysts across multiple facilities asked the same pressing question. Was this merely a training operation, or the opening move of something far larger? Within minutes, it became clear that this was no standard delivery or patrol. It was a clear statement, a deliberate signal carried on the wind right to Russia's border. But to understand the true weight of that moment, one had to grasp why this particular aircraft inspired both fear and respect. The CH-47 Chinook was far more than a piece of machinery. It was the embodiment of logistical power, the airborne backbone of modern warfare. Designed to transport the heaviest loads with precision, it could carry troops, vehicles, weaponry, even other helicopters. For decades, it had served as a cornerstone of American mobility, ensuring that soldiers could be moved swiftly and safely to any theater of conflict. In Vietnam, it crossed dense jungles, ferrying artillery over impassable terrain. In Afghanistan, it carried special forces deep into treacherous valleys where no other aircraft could land. And in Iraq, it was essential for supplying encircled troops and evacuating the wounded. A fleet of Chinooks that size could reposition an entire combat group faster than many nations could even react. That was why Russia immediately understood. The sudden appearance of 50 of these machines on NATO's eastern flank was not a simple show of force. It was a calculated display of capability. The operation had begun quietly, far from the border, on a U.S. military base in Germany. During the night, pilots worked through their checklists with methodical focus. Mechanics filled every tank to capacity, and soldiers loaded containers labeled Forward Mobility Assets. Their destination, Poland's eastern frontier. Though at that hour, almost no one outside the mission command knew that. Later, satellite photographs would capture the remarkable scene. Chinooks lined up in flawless rows on the airfield, their rotors beginning to spin in unison, like the gears of a massive clock. Moments later, all 50 lifted off simultaneously, flying east at low altitude, hugging the contours of the land so closely that they almost blended with the dawn. On Russian radar screens, a swarm of moving dots appeared, a formation advancing toward Kaliningrad with storm-like velocity. By the time Russian fighters were scrambled, the American helicopters had already neared Polish airspace. With the first rays of sunlight, the residents of Białystok and Suwałki heard an unfamiliar low rumble. Curious, many stepped outside, filming with their phones as a wave of U.S. Chinooks swept across the fields, flanked by Apache gunships and Blackhawks. From rooftops, the view was breathtaking. A wall of metal gliding through the skies above eastern Poland, barely 50 miles from the Belarusian border. Troops, armored vehicles, and heavy equipment were unloaded with astonishing speed. Within hours, the fields had transformed into a fully operational U.S. deployment zone, capable of rapid movement and instant response to any threat. It looked less like a drill and more like preparation for an immediate confrontation, and that was precisely what set off alarms in Moscow. Inside Russia's Ministry of Defense, warning lights flashed across control panels. Orders were relayed through multiple channels, satellite imagery was requested, and within minutes, the Kremlin demanded a live analysis of the situation. Radar stations reported unprecedented numbers of aircraft along NATO's frontier. Kremlin spokespersons appeared before cameras condemning what they called a deliberate American provocation, warning of a dangerous escalation right at Russia's doorstep. Russian fighter jets took off from Kaliningrad, flying parallel to the border but staying strictly within their own airspace. Everyone involved knew that even a minor mistake, a radar misreading, a drift across the invisible line, could ignite open conflict. Still, the message had already been received. The United States had delivered men, machines, and logistics directly to Russia's edge, without firing a single shot. When the Chinooks completed their drops, the sky still vibrated with the echo of their rotors. On the ground, American soldiers began establishing defensive positions. Mobile artillery units were assembled, tactical tents erected, and engineers set up temporary command posts. Overhead, unmanned drones circled, their cameras scanning the terrain toward Belarus. To an outside observer, it might have resembled a drill, but in truth, It was a live demonstration of logistical precision. The US wanted to prove that it could deploy forces anywhere in Europe within hours. It was a message to Russia, to NATO allies, and to the world. The footage released shortly afterward showed a striking sight. Dozens of American transport helicopters neatly aligned on NATO soil, engines idling, ready for redeployment at a moment's notice. For Moscow, the images were unsettling. They proved that the United States could project large-scale power to the eastern frontier in less than a day, far faster than anyone in the Kremlin had anticipated. This was no ordinary exercise. It was a declaration in motion. NATO could respond faster than Russia could escalate. For Poland and the Baltic states, it meant reassurance and solidarity. For the rest of the world, it was visible proof of American determination and reach. Psychologically, it was an exhibition of control. While Russia traditionally relied on intimidation and threats, America demonstrated a different form of strength, one grounded in precision, coordination, and speed. 50 Chinooks sweeping through the morning sky conveyed more than any press conference ever could. Polish officials praised the operation as a symbol of Western unity. Across Germany, Lithuania, and Latvia, military analysts described it as the clearest sign of U.S. readiness since the Cold War's end. Yet admiration was tinged with unease. Every NATO commander knew the implications. If Moscow viewed the exercise as a provocation, Eastern Europe could again become the center of global tension. The deployment of rocket launchers near the frontier only deepened the unease. In Moscow, the atmosphere grew grim. President Putin called an emergency meeting with his top security advisors. Russian state media broadcast almost non-stop footage of the American helicopters landing in Poland, claiming that NATO was preparing for an attack. Meanwhile, in Washington, officials tried to calm the narrative. Pentagon spokespeople insisted that the troop movements were part of a long-planned drill called Operation Defender Europe. But behind closed doors, diplomats admitted that both the scale and the timing of the maneuver were chosen deliberately, as a warning not only to Russia but to its allies in Beijing and Tehran. The message was unmistakable. The United States remained capable of projecting overwhelming force anywhere, anytime. With 50 Chinooks now stationed within reach of Russian territory, the situation grew increasingly charged. Analysts debated possible next steps: joint air exercises, live fire drills involving NATO F-35s and Apaches, the establishment of new supply bases in eastern Poland, and the potential for long-term troop deployments. There were even rumors of covert operations, testing new electronic surveillance systems or mapping Russian radar coverage around Kaliningrad. Although officially framed as a defensive maneuver, Moscow perceived it as an act of aggression. Historically, misunderstandings of this kind had often led to escalation, and the world remembered those lessons all too well. The tension rose sharply, suspended between diplomatic caution and military alertness, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. For the soldiers aboard those helicopters, the situation was tangible and immediate. They knew what it meant to operate this close to Russian soil. Many had served in Afghanistan or Iraq and understood the weight behind every radio call, every static crackle in their headsets. The constant thrum of rotor blades over Europe's frosted forests reminded them that they were only one breath away from possible conflict. Some looked out through the Chinook's narrow windows, watching the snow-covered landscape slide by. Villages, fields, forests fading into the pale morning haze. Beyond the horizon lay Russia, a land they had no wish to enter, but whose presence they could feel pressing against them. The silence between missions carried a heavy kind of awareness, not quite war, not quite peace, something suspended in between. For Poland, the arrival of the Americans brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it meant protection, tangible proof that NATO would intervene if needed. On the other, it turned the country into a potential target should hostilities break out. Polish news outlets dubbed the operation Operation Shield, a name evoking defense and strength. But military commentators voiced caution. Russia could choose asymmetric retaliation, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, or troop shifts near the infamous Suwałki Gap, that narrow corridor between Poland and Lithuania regarded as NATO's most vulnerable stretch. In this climate, there was no turning back. The line between deterrence and provocation had blurred beyond recognition, and no one could predict how long the fragile balance would last. New satellite images released just days later confirmed the worst fears of defense analysts. Russia had begun repositioning artillery units toward Kaliningrad. The rhetoric on state television hardened noticeably. Official spokesmen declared that Moscow would respond appropriately if NATO refused to halt its activities. Yet behind the harsh words, Western intelligence reports painted a subtler picture. Russia's leadership wasn't furious. It was uneasy. The Americans had just proven that they could deliver their heaviest transport assets to the frontier in under 24 hours. That single fact altered the entire strategic equation. The comfortable assumption that Moscow would have ample time to react to any large-scale NATO movement had vanished overnight. The new reality forced generals and policymakers alike to rethink everything from logistics to early warning systems. Thus began a new phase of military planning, not only for Russia, but across Europe. The Chinook airlift hadn't just carried troops and hardware, it had transported an idea, one that crossed borders faster than any aircraft could. The awareness that geography no longer guaranteed safety. The sense of security that had settled over Eastern Europe after the Cold War had been quietly dismantled, replaced by a shared unease that no one could quite dispel. In Washington and Brussels, strategists debated how the East might respond. Tensions stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, like a taut wire ready to vibrate at the slightest touch. Every radar blip, every unidentified signal risked being misinterpreted as aggression. A single false alarm, an errant sensor reading, any of it could ignite something irreversible. Within NATO command circles, planning continued relentlessly. Contingencies were mapped out hour by hour. If Russia countered with its own troop movement, NATO would match it immediately. Air and ground coordination exercises multiplied. F-35 fighter jets practiced rapid response missions alongside Apaches and Chinooks, simulating joint maneuvers that could be executed within minutes. Electronic warfare divisions joined in. Specialists trained to jam radar, scramble communications, and track every pulse of electronic activity emanating from across the border. Publicly, officials maintained the narrative of defense. Privately, many admitted that the line between deterrence and dominance had become almost indistinguishable. Deep within underground command centers in the east, Russian generals monitored satellite imagery showing the steady movement of NATO forces. State-run news channels looped footage of the Chinooks landing, labeling them instruments of aggression, while announcing a counter-operation. They called it Operation Determination, Operacja Решимость. Tanks rumbled along frozen highways, missile batteries disappeared into dense forest cover, and fighter jets flew intimidating patrols along the frontier. Television broadcasts showed martial processions, confident voices, patriotic slogans, but beneath the bravado, nervousness simmered. The West's swift, disciplined mobility had exposed a critical weakness on the Russian side: inertia. NATO's ability to reposition in hours before Moscow could issue a coherent response revealed a shift in the very physics of modern warfare. Speed had become the most potent weapon of all. Across Europe, reactions were mixed. NATO officials described the maneuver as a show of power with a stabilizing purpose. One general involved in the operation told reporters that speed itself was the new safeguard. If we can act faster than the enemy can plan, we prevent war before it starts. His words spread through political circles like a new doctrine. Governments repeated them. News anchors dissected them. Economists speculated on their implications for defense spending and security markets. At the stock exchanges in Warsaw and Frankfurt, investors reacted nervously. Shares of defense contractors rose sharply, while energy prices wavered in response to rumors of possible supply disruptions. In the border towns of Poland and Lithuania, people watched convoys of foreign military vehicles roll by. Armored carriers with unfamiliar insignia, escorted by the constant echo of helicopter blades overhead. It felt like history repeating itself, but this time in high definition. For many families living near the frontier, the same question lingered in every household, the same one their grandparents had asked half a century earlier. Did this buildup mean peace through preparedness? Or the prelude to war? While soldiers fortified, positions on the ground, a new, invisible front opened above the digital landscape. Cyber groups on both sides launched operations, spreading misinformation, distorting videos, fabricating headlines. Fake reports claimed clashes at the border. Doctored images of explosions circulated through social media, sparking panic. Each camp claimed to control the narrative, though truth itself became impossible to verify. In this evolving form of warfare, the first shot was no longer physical. It was informational. The first viral post, the first manipulated image capable of shaking public confidence. Analysts began calling it the battle of perception. In modern conflict, they argued, truth was both the first casualty and the first weapon. Amid this fog of narratives, the Chinook took on a symbolic role. In photographs and broadcasts, it meant different things depending on perspective. To the West, it represented strength, readiness, reassurance. To the East, it stood for intimidation, provocation, and dominance. It became an icon of an age where meaning itself was contested. Still, behind the symbolism lay the hard reality of a mobilized military machine. Defense specialists sketched out 3 plausible paths for the coming weeks. The first, controlled tension. Exercises would continue, accompanied by constant surveillance and verbal sparring, but without direct engagement. The second, limited escalation. An accidental encounter, a shot fired in confusion, triggering a brief chain of retaliations before diplomacy could intervene. And the third, the most feared, open conflict. A direct clash between Western and Eastern forces born from a single misjudgment. In private sessions, NATO defense ministers discussed the risk spectrum. Some urged a slowdown. The point had been made, they argued. Russia had received the intended signal. Others disagreed, insisting that pressure must be maintained. Uncertainty itself, they said, was leverage. The exercise schedules were adjusted weekly. Flight routes altered. Operation times shuffled, maintaining an unpredictable rhythm that kept Moscow guessing. Strategy became choreography, a deliberate, dangerous dance in which every movement was a message. The synchronized motion of 50 Chinooks cutting through the dawn had already become a global image of power. Television stations replayed the footage endlessly. To most viewers, it resembled a cinematic sequence, something staged for dramatic effect. But for the soldiers inside those aircraft, it was painfully real. In the East, whispers of war spread like static. Families prepared emergency kits. Schools reviewed evacuation plans. In the West, by contrast, many felt safer, comforted by the visible presence of Allied forces. Each side believed it was right. Each side feared the other. Border patrols increased in frequency. Drones droned ceaselessly across the night sky. In the frozen forests, every snap of a branch, every echo, off. The snow seemed suspicious. Soldiers later recalled how even the smallest sounds set their nerves on edge. Supply convoys rolled in continuously, trains loaded with fuel, food, and ammunition, heading toward makeshift depots near the frontier. Local authorities rehearsed emergency protocols. Mayors met privately with military officials, reviewing evacuation blueprints and shelter networks. Some even discussed reopening Cold War-era bunkers long thought obsolete. Elder residents shook their heads and muttered that history had found a way to repeat itself, only this time with drones and satellites replacing spies and sirens. Indeed, while many thought of the past, others faced a troubling future. This was no longer a conflict contained to one region. The world was watching in real time. Live feeds, satellite streams, social media updates. Every movement, every formation shift, every misstep could spark instant global reaction. In the days that followed, the tension along the eastern border thickened into something almost tangible, a mixture of technological precision and human unease. Reporters from around the world flooded into Poland, setting up cameras on distant hills to capture columns of moving armor. The air buzzed constantly. Helicopters, drones, transport planes, each layer of sound blending into a relentless background hum. The footage dominated international news cycles. Analysts dissected troop formations. Politicians debated the strategic meaning. Historians drew parallels to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the height of Cold War brinkmanship. Everyone agreed on one point. Europe's balance of power had shifted. Meanwhile, soldiers in the field worked tirelessly in the cold. They built camps, reinforced roads, set up temporary airstrips. Every motion was logged, every order recorded. American commanders called it a readiness test. But behind the official phrasing, simulations and contingency scenarios were being quietly run. The key question loomed. How would Moscow respond next? Would this remain a war of nerves, or would Russia push back physically? In the Kremlin, deliberations intensified. President Putin received situation briefings almost hourly. High-resolution aerial imagery showed the exact placement of NATO units. Russian newscasts replayed footage of the Chinooks over and over, each time accompanied by commentary predicting imminent aggression. NATO advances, anchors declared gravely. Russia will defend itself. But behind closed doors, the tone was far less defiant. Many advisors understood the stakes. A direct clash would be catastrophic for all. Yet trust had evaporated. Each side suspected the other of deception, each convinced that restraint might be read as weakness. In Western capitals, the dilemma was equally sharp. Should they continue signaling strength or open channels for dialogue? In Brussels, the NATO Security Council convened under secrecy. Generals spoke of controlled escalation, a strategy designed to exert pressure while avoiding the point of no return. It was a perilous balancing act. In the age of automated defense systems and instantaneous communication, even a momentary glitch could have apocalyptic consequences. One misread signal, one malfunctioning radar, Bowker, one pilot's overreaction. That was all it would take to unleash a chain reaction that no one could stop. For civilians near the frontier, tension had become part of daily life. Schools conducted safety drills, hospitals revised their emergency logistics, gas stations reported surging demand as people quietly began stockpiling fuel and supplies. At the same time, Washington released new satellite images, insisting that every maneuver was purely defensive. But to the east, the images meant little. The silhouette of those Chinooks, enormous, disciplined, and silent, had already become a psychological weapon in itself. Intelligence briefings soon confirmed what many feared. Russia was repositioning artillery and short-range missile systems closer to Kaliningrad. Western leaders interpreted this as proof that deterrence worked. Yet privately, analysts admitted that the situation was more volatile than at any point in recent memory. As days turned into weeks, it began to feel as if history was looping. Only this time, the world was watching live. Every citizen could follow developments through streams, data feeds, and online trackers. The planet had become both spectator and commentator. Then came a brief stillness. As the sun dipped behind the Polish plains and the Chinook's engines quieted for the night, the weight of everything that had unfolded hung in the air. Soldiers stood silently under the pale light, gazing eastward toward the unseen border. They knew they were part of something larger than themselves, a contest of will and power that could decide the fate of a continent. And somewhere deep within each of them lingered the same thought. Was this truly deterrence, or the dawn of something far darker? Because those Chinooks, those colossal machines of metal and precision, had done more than transport troops. They had carried a message, one that ushered in a new era, an age where strength was measured not just in firepower, but in speed, accuracy, and the ability to alter equilibrium within a single day. And so, the operation ended not with the echo of gunfire, but with a whisper, a subtle yet unmistakable signal to the world. Europe's borders were no longer quiet, and the wind stirred by the Chinook's blades would be felt for a long time to come.